Hello everyone, and welcome to the next anime retrospective on OAM. Now, due to personal reasons, I felt like skipping the one-off productions and just getting right into the next series. And for this series of videos, we will be looking at Sunrise's, currently Bandai Namco Filmworks, 1996 production, The Vision of Escaflowne, which I may mispronounce as Escaflowne, or simply refer to as VOE from time to time. Now, before we get into the plot of the series itself, I'd like to speak about the series just a little bit before we get into things. Now, Escaflowne is another great viewer suggestion that I have received, and in fact, it's one of the earliest I received, though I initially did not consider it because I was under the false impression that the series was never completed, because I misread the Wikipedia article on it. This, of course, was a reading error on my part, and the series is in fact well concluded and well loved. And I can see why it is too, as it is a great series, and one I quite enjoyed. The fantastical setting and the characters, combined with an excellent soundtrack and a level-headed protagonist, makes for a great story, especially when we consider that as an earlier isekai, a word with a negative connotation in some circles these days, VOE leaves out a lot of the later gimmicky tropes that people associate with later works. Instead, VOE is a real powerhouse that focuses on its characters growing in a fantastical setting, while still being very human at their core. It's a real powerhouse, it's visually gorgeous, and it's just great entertainment. After having watched Blue Gender and rewatching most of Neon Genesis Evangelion, I will also say that the Vision of Escaflowne was a great breath of fresh air. While Blue Gender and Eva are good series, they're not what I would consider the happiest of productions. And while Escaflowne still has serious moments and good character growth and important messages overall, its general tone and look and feel is just a lot more pleasant. The characters are all likable and friendly enough. Hitomi is especially a great protagonist, and interpersonal communication is unusually open and honest. I bring that up because I just watched Evangelion, where it's the exact opposite. Combine this with a whimsical setting and the themes of discovering oneself and one's own heart, and you have an all-around pleasant and universal piece worth your watching. I say universal because I also want to take a second to dismiss any criticism that Escaflowne is, quote, just a chick flick. I mean, yes, the main character is female, but the series is not really aimed towards any one party in general. It's an all-around good story that really anyone, I think, could enjoy. Yeah, the main character is female, but she never really manifests any real, quote, women stereotypes, and she's very likable. In fact, I'd consider her a great protagonist, as while supportive of others, she still stands up for herself and her own interests. Hitomi is very self-aware, well-rounded, grounded, and thoughtful, but she's still human enough to be relatable. While romance is a key plot point and theme of the series, and it isn't focused on to the extent where it becomes a detriment to the wider plot of the series, even if it is critical to it. In addition, I'd like to also note that the romance in Escaflowne is handled relatively well for the most part. There are a few issues which we'll look at later. Depending on your own views and experiences, it may not be the most realistic, but everyone is relatively mature about things, and there isn't any real dramatic, soapy moments. I found it quite refreshing that the trope of two male characters having a falling out and fighting over a woman doesn't actually happen. In fact, everyone in the series is pretty good about just taking the L almost in every occasion, and there's quite a few, but it's quite refreshing just seeing people talk about things and just go, well, it is what it is, because sometimes it just is what it is. I'd also like to note that while VOE may be labeled as a chick flick by some people, it has a lot of disparate elements which don't necessarily have an inherent female bias. Fantastical settings, airships, mechs, and mole man, those can appeal to anyone. It's just an all-around good show, and something that I think almost anyone can enjoy. Anyways, with my preamble concluded, let's get into the actual plot of the series. Now, the Vision of Escaflowne centers on the clairvoyant Hitomi Kanzaki, and her travels to the parallel dimension, planet, place, dream, whatever, of Gaia. They say it's a planet, but it's not quite clear. The series opens in Japan, where Hitomi is a member of the school track team, and while practicing track, sees a vision of an odd man fighting a dragon and faints. She later wakes up in the nurse's office, and upon being informed that track captain Amano is leaving soon, she decides to set up a late-night track meet with him in order to confess her feelings. Here, she hopes to beat her personal best in order to get a kiss from her. Amano uses her lucky pendant as a pendulum clock to see if she can beat her personal best of 13 seconds. While she's running, she again sees the man from her earlier visions, who this time manifests in a physical form alongside a dangerous dragon, The man and the dragon fight while Hitomi, her friend Yukari, and Amano all run away. While doing so, however, Hitomi has a vision of the dragon killing the man, and as such runs back to warn the man and in turn saves him. This allows the man to kill the dragon, claim its energist, this orb, and travel home, although he inadvertently takes Hitomi with him. And this sees Hitomi arrive at Gaia, the magical setting for about 99% of the story, that while seemingly medieval, is actually in some ways more advanced than our societies today. In Gaia, she learns that the man she saved is actually Van, or in some dubs, Vaughn, the king of Finalia, who, in return for saving him, promises to get Hitomi back safely. Before he can do so, though, Vaughn must be coronated as the king of Finalia, as by having killed a dragon, he has completed the rite necessary to be considered the king of Finalia and to also activate Escaflowne, a Gaia-Malef, a kind of mech prevalent in the series, which is closely tied to both the mystical powers of Gaia and Vaughn's own royal lineage. During the coronation, however, Finalia is attacked and burned to the ground by the forces of the Zybok Empire, led by the bloodthirsty Lord Delandau and the grim, somber Lord Falcon. While the civilians are evacuated and Vaughn intends to fight on, he is convinced to flee alongside Hitomi as Finalia burns. They are almost captured, though do make a last-second escape which sees the two get separated. This magical escape seems to be the manifestation of Hitomi's latent psychic powers, and these powers assist her greatly throughout the series in the forms of precognitions, dowsing, future sight, and some other useful abilities which from time to time even include teleportation. Having been separated from Vaughn, Hitomi is discovered by Alan Shazar, who proceeds to rescue her and take her to an outpost of the Kingdom of Astoria, and he also looks astonishingly like Amano, which Hitomi does notice. At this outpost, she reunites with Vaughn, who informs Alan of Finalia's fate. A follow-up attack by Zalbak on the outpost convinces Alan that he needs to help him, and Hitomi reach the King of Asturias in order to seek justice for what has occurred. This sees the group flee in the Crusade, an airship belonging to Alan, although they are intercepted and Vaughn is even briefly captured. While he is rescued by Alan and Hitomi, he spends enough time in captivity to learn that Falcon is actually his brother, who failed to kill a dragon, and he also manages to literally scar Delandau for life. Upon reaching Asturias, Alan is reunited with Malerna, a princess who, while in love with him, is unaware of the fact that Alan used to love her sister and kind of leads her on, and a princess who also loathes her status as a royal with no real power. Upon reaching the king, Alan's request for justice against the Zalbak is denied, as the king is realistically aware of the fact that he lacks the power needed to right the wrongs that have occurred, and just kind of has Vaughn and Hitomi lie low for a while. While Hitomi resigns herself to the fact that Alan is already claimed by, and seems to be somewhat interested in Malerna, Delandau again strikes, and Vaughn and Hitomi are ultimately forced to leave the kingdom after being discovered. In addition, for having helped the wanted man, Alan is arrested. While Alan sits around in jail, Vaughn and Hitomi raid a Zybok mining operation, though it doesn't go according to plan, and Vaughn uses his wings to rescue Hitomi. This reveals himself to be the angel that she has seen in some of her visions. It turns out that Vaughn is half Draconian, the so-called cursed race of Atlantis, and thus has wings. Anyways, the two reunite with Alan on the way to the Duchy of Freld, or Fried in the dub, to warn the Duke of Fried of an impending Zybok attack, and Hitomi and Van were subconsciously doing the same as they were following Hitomi's dowsing intuition. A skirmish occurs and Alan is seriously wounded, though he is saved by Malerna, who happened to run away, happened to be on the same convoy that Vaughn and Alan and Hitomi run into, and happened to have studied medicine in the past. Once in Freld, the now core cast warns the prince, who in turn vouches for them after some doppelganger shenanigans sees them wrongly incarcerated. Between this and the big battle, Malerna also learns that the prince is actually Alan's secret son, and that Alan scored with her now dead sister. This does have repercussions later. Anyways, Zalbak forces enter Freld, torch the capital, and force the Duke and the main cast to flee to the Fortuna Temple. This temple is a power spot, and home to the power of Atlantis, which the Duke and Prince ultimately have to yield to Zybok after being beaten to a pulp. This sees the main cast forced to run away again, and Vaughn seriously hurt again, as it turns out that he and Escaflowne are bound by blood and reflect damage upon each other. Luckily, they also happen to run into Dryden, Malerna's wealthy, arranged fiancé, who knows how to summon a repair team and then has enough money to also pay for said repairs. Feeling much better, but angry, Vaughn then proceeds to go out and kill all of Delandau's knights in the ensuing struggle, which finally breaks Delandau for a while, causing him to have a severe mental breakdown. In light of this, he is taken by some sorcerers back to the Zybok capital to be, quote, experimented upon. Dryden then joins the cast and resolves to discover the lost secret of Atlantis, both in order to fulfill his own personal curiosity and to kind of see what the crew should do next. The group then heads to the Mystic Valley in order to discover the secret of Atlantis and end up followed by Zalbak forces. It turns out, though, that even though Zybok has the power spot, they still need Van and Hitomi, as when together they can upset fate and therefore upset the Emperor's ambitions, which we'll get to later. With Hitomi's pendant, the group inadvertently manages to open a portal to Atlantis, and each of the three main casts has a series of revelations bestowed upon them. Alan learns of his father's past. Now this father of his kind of walked out on Alan and his mother, which in turn greatly scarred Alan and led him to have a great amount of resentment for him. The reason he did so was, in fact, to pursue the secret of Atlantis, as he had seen Hitomi's grandmother, an earlier Earthling who had been kind of teleported to Gaia under similar mysterious circumstances. While her grandmother doesn't necessarily have a big role in the series, it is just a weird, interesting connection. Vaughn, on the other hand, has a revelation where he is forced to confront his own hesitancy of battle, his own fear of fighting, as even though brave, he still has the inherent fear that many of us have when it comes to confrontation. This is kind of him coming to terms with his own hesitancy to both rule and lead, and his process of becoming a more mature leader. Hitomi, on the other hand, gets scolded by a dead woman for using tarot cards. This one's a weird one, as yes, it does say that Hitomi needs to make her own fate as opposed to trying to predict fate, but it's kind of clunkily handled, and it just kind of seems like she's getting nagged after having carried the team for, a good few many engagements as it was. The group then ends up in Atlantis, where Hitomi needs to rescue Alan and Van from their own psychic visions. Some more magicking ensures, and the three main cast are then teleported to Emperor Dornkirk's lab, which contains his fate altercation engine, or prognostication engine, or there's several names for it. Dornkirk is the leader of the Zybok Empire, and explains his backstory and goal of controlling destiny itself. He wants to create a world free of conflict by physically controlling destiny, as at least to him it's a physical force which can be scientifically understood with enough experimentation and research. While his desire to create a, quote, happy destiny for everyone sounds okay, if not good, his methods and how he goes about things are not, and it's obvious that he's not a very warm man. Not much else happens while in Zybok's capital, and the trio eventually break out and reunite with the secondary cast back in Astoria. Dornkirk now knows that he must keep Hitomi and Vaughn's secret in order to achieve his ideal fate, as he knows that for some reason when they're together they have the power to make their own fate, and therefore disrupt his plans of creating an artificial fate to satisfy everyone. He thus turns on his machine, and thus literally manipulates fate to have Alan and Hitomi fall in love. Vaughn kind of sees this, and does take the L quite well, resigning himself to trusting Alan with Hitomi's care. Meanwhile, Malerna's arranged marriage to Dryden does go through, and ultimately gets crashed by Vulcan and his cat assassins, who seem to kind of be a substitute for Delandau, after Delandau, of course, is carted off. Hitomi surrenders herself to stop the attack, feeling guilty for consciously not warning the group of the dangers of the wedding, although she is ultimately released and witnesses Vulcan's fortress explode. Inside, Vulcan is disgusted by Dornkirk's lack of empathy, and finally reasons to abandon him. This sees him ultimately team up with Vaughn, and helps assemble a coalition to oppose Zybok. Several battles are fought, and Hitomi has to psychically witness one through her connection with Vaughn. The carnage and brutality are so shocking to her that she ends up teleporting herself back home for a bit and kind of reliving the days leading up to the first episode, and reflecting upon both herself and what she wants in life. She now knows that she doesn't quite know what she wants, and that Yukari was the one who really loved Amano the whole time. She decides instead to put her friend first, and then questions what to do. As she does, a tarot card blows over, and she realizes what she really wants is Vaughn. As such, she does make sure to return the Gaia and help him out, through the power of thought. Yes, this is how it is explained in the story. In the story, it's explained that she and Vaughn are so strongly connected that when they both think about each other, it's enough to warp one over to the other side. Oh yeah, Delandau is actually Alan's brainwashed sister, who Dornkirk kidnapped and tested out, quote, fate alteration experiments upon. This doesn't really do much for the rest of the series, but it is an interesting revelation, and a twist that, I will admit, it got me. It even makes Delandau kind of relatable, which is impressive considering how unlikable he was in most of his appearances up until this point. Anyways, Gaia is now enveloped by war, and Hitomi decides to confront Dornkirk personally alongside Vulcan. Vulcan does kill Dornkirk, although he dies in the process, which upsets Hitomi enough which ends up activating the Fate Altercation device. While Dornkirk said this device should make a happy world, what it does is that it just makes everyone bloodthirsty as they give into their own brutal desires. And Dornkirk just kind of stands in the background as a ghost and goes, well, I guess humanity sucks, resigning himself to the, quote, undesirable traits of humanity. Due to the nature of the Destiny Machine, even Vaughn and Alan are driven to fight each other. Alan trying to protect Selena, formerly Delandau, whom Vaughn is now bent on killing. Hitomi, however, telepathically calms Vaughn down, who is in the midst of this fighting. Vaughn, in turn, flies away to her, and in the process gathers feathers which calm everyone down, while Alan smiles and accepts the fact that Vaughn is the one that she truly loves. The war ends, and the long rebuilding ceremony begins. In the final scenes, Vaughn and Hitomi confess their feelings for each other, and that while Hitomi must go home, the two take solace in the fact that they can see each other whenever they want by simply thinking about each other, and that they will always be in each other's hearts. All in all, the Vision of Escaflowne is quite a ride, and a great one at that. While the plot does move kind of fast, and it may seem a little dense here and there when explained in this kind of way, when actually watched, its pacing works surprisingly well. It moves fast enough to keep up one's interest and the tension in the series, while still taking time for personal scenes and character development. In addition, in a world where magic is normal and not everything is fully explained, a lot of the episodes, at least the earlier ones, do a good amount of setup and payoff. Something seemingly inconsequential may happen, although this often provides a payoff for an important event later. Yes, it is fair to say that the series isn't perfect, but most of its flaws lie in logistical issues outside of the core points, or the core cast of the series. The most prominent issue is some of the romance which takes place in the story, as the love triangle between Vaughn, Hitomi, and Alan is kind of weird when we take ages into consideration, and while it did make me a little uncomfortable, thinking about it, the optics of it are not very good for Alan, and it does make scenes like this kind of weird, which, they did make me a little uncomfortable. However, I would also like to note that Hitomi and Vaughn are actually the same age, so that's not that weird. It's just that the optics of the age dynamic don't make Alan look very good. Although I would also like to point out that Dornkirk literally manipulated fate to make this happen. So it is implied that this isn't necessarily a natural outcome, and both characters do seem to be somewhat aware of that. Though they do lend themselves to a few unintentionally uncomfortable moments. I understand it's supposed to be like a young woman fantasizing about a literal knight in shining armor. However, when you take the actual optics and logistics of things into consideration, it doesn't look that good. I don't think this was something that the writers intentionally did. I think this is just one of those oversights that ends up in a Japanese fantasy piece. I don't think they were really thinking about the logistics of things, and of course, their flaws and logistics are different, of course, but that doesn't change the fact that the optics of certain scenes are a little uncomfortable, although again, Hitomi and Vaughn are the same age, and this series actually has very little fan service, so it could have been a lot worse. Now, I will be the first to admit I don't quite understand all the mythological laws controlling Gaia, or how Dornkirk built a machine to control Destiny, or how all the magic works, or if there's any set magic laws, or if everything operates on an ad hoc basis, or a lot of things, in all honesty. There are some logistical issues present in the series. However, these are relatively minuscule, and while I did from time to time ask, how does that work? It was never a big deal because A, the series is one where magic is a thing and divining is a thing, as well as psychic powers, so I have no problem with the series going, well, it's magic, a few times. It doesn't do it enough to the point where it's an issue, so a few times I'm fine with. And B, the logistics aren't the core of the story, so them being a little inconsistent here and there don't really ruin it for me. The only other issue I guess you could say I noticed with the series was how its core messages get a little muddled here and there. Now, the core ideas of pacifism and creating one's own destiny and accepting the facts on the ground are all fine, but sometimes the show handles them in a way that isn't always optimal. Sometimes they are handled in a little bit of a clunky manner. For example, Hitomi gets scolded for using fortune-telling in line with the theme of creating one's destiny. This makes sense, as the show is telling the viewer, through Hitomi, to be more proactive and to make positive life changes to affect a positive future, instead of passively relying on a possible future. It's a warning against passively slipping into an unhappy destiny by simply assuming that destiny is pre-made. this is a good message. However, sometimes it isn't always handled 100% consistently or well. While VOE does say that fear can create bad self-fulfilling prophecies, the way it does so doesn't necessarily make sense. It doesn't say that Hitomi fortune-telling resigns herself to passivity, but instead that doing so literally changes fate. In addition, Hitomi is specifically told that she should trust her feelings and try to change her own destiny any way she can. However, when she does so, it kind of backfires a few times, in spite of all that she's been told up until that point. In addition, while the generic theme of war is bad, is a good theme to promote, I'm not going to disagree with it, how it's handled is also a little clunky. While Zybox War to Stop War is a good showing of the hypocrisy of violence, people getting berated for self-defense in literal life or death situations isn't the best. There are some points where the series does come off as a little preachy or clunky in regards to this theme, although these are limited enough to where they're basically inconsequential. Again, the core idea is sound, so even if the execution's a little clunky, it's not a deal breaker. They don't distract from the core of the series, and the core of the story is in fact Hitomi, and her own development and discoveries. And she's written in a way that makes this work excellently. Her writing and the writing of the rest of the cast is by far good enough to make me overlook a few confusing happenings every now and again. They're written very well, they're all quite likable, and again, they're all quite mature, really. So these few issues with the Japanese version of the series don't really bother me. I specify Japanese subtitled version because the dubs have their own little quirks, which I'll mention in a bit. Another thing that's its own little quirk is the Vision of Escaflowne movie. It's kind of a sort of retelling, but not really, of the original series, with some very big differences. It has drastically different characterization, character designs, and tone. And for that reason, it's both very jarring and very fascinating to watch. In the movie, Falcon is the main antagonist, and the characters of Hitomi and Van are slightly different, although it does still look gorgeous. The plot also deviates in many major points, although its ending is kind of similar, I guess. While the movie is perfectly capable of standing up on its own, having just watched it after having watched the entire 26-episode series, it just feels a little bit off to me. It's just so different in terms of tone and plot and characterization that it's a fascinating, weird little thing. Again, while the movie is fine, I love the original series so much that upon watching the movie afterwards, it just felt a tad off. Now this of course is a statement of my own bias, as I simply prefer the original series, and it's not an insult to the movie. In fact, I found the movie quite fascinating, although it does feel quite off going from the mostly generic positive of the series to the very dark and visceral tone of the movie. It is fascinating to me, and I personally like it, although if you don't because of how drastically different it is from the series, and how it kind of, I don't want to say disrespects, but maybe disregards some of the original series messages and tones and characters, I can understand why people don't like this movie, as it's so different, it doesn't even feel like something based on the series of Escaflowne. I mean, the movie's good. It just means that the movie is very different from the series, and that I won't really touch on it from this point on in the retrospective, as it's kind of outside of the scope of it. What will be within the scope of this retrospective, and touched on though, is the different dubs of Escaflowne. Now as mentioned earlier, I wanted to speak on the dubs for a second. Escaflowne has a few dubs, some of which more notable than others. Originally the series was distributed in the West as a subtitled piece, although an English dub for it was made by Ocean in around the year 2000. This dub did have a few development issues. It went on to become the default dub and was actually quite good, even if it is a little dated from time to time. I say this because it is clear that every now and again the actors don't always have the best direction, and sometimes it seems like they might be a little confused. It is a very good dub though, and all the characters sound like you would expect them to. I've seen it both dubbed and subtitled, and I think either version is good. Something that not everyone may agree with is good though is what Fox Kids ended up doing to this dub. You see, while the Ocean dub is on many DVDs of the series and was even broadcast in some areas, for some reason it was also broadcast in an edited format by Fox Kids, who modified the dub for, their own purposes to create their own version of the series. This version of the show was quite edited and made some drastic changes. These edits went well beyond normal dubbing issues and some audio ADR stuff here and there, and it resulted in a very unique creation which downplayed Hitomi's role, tried to frame Vaughn as the main character of the series, cut out a lot of scenes, added, quote, recap scenes, and even modified the OST, greatly altering the original show. Although I will admit that those modified songs are still catchy. This dub was certainly unique, and while the dubbing itself was still the ocean version of it, this series, or this iteration of Escaflowne, was so edited that, depending on who you ask, it was somewhere between pretty cool in a cheesy way or garbage. Opinions vary. And it wasn't very successful in terms of ratings. It was, though, an early anime piece for many, though, and I respect it for that. I don't want to dunk on it too hard, as, again, Fox Kids did what Fox Kids did, and they took a series and modified it. It did introduce many people to a great series, though, and I'm not gonna knock it for that. It's just an interesting curiosity. Also, it had probably one of the most hyped Fox Kids trailers I've ever seen. This is pretty dope. Finally, in 2016, a new dub was released by Funimation after a Kickstarter campaign, and this resulted in an additional dub with a whole new cast. I haven't seen this dub, although I've heard it's good. While each of these dubs has their own charms, for the sake of this retrospective, I'm using a subtitled version of the series for both consistency's sake and because I happen to own a subtitled version on DVD. All in all, though, I think I love the Vision of Escaflowne, as it's simply a great story with a great cast. Its whimsical and magical setting pair excellently with a humbled and grounded cast who are easy to get along with and sympathize with. Escaflowne is simply great, and its setting and its story and its characters recreate a magical setting which are just so easy to fall into. I don't think I've felt this whimsically swept off my feet since I've seen a Studio Ghibli movie. Now, this isn't a Ghibli movie or production. Miyazaki has nothing to do with the series. I just say that to really hype up how engrossing the series is and how kind of unique it felt, at least to me. It just feels so magical. Sure, the plot may be a tad muddled here and there. Sure, some of the messages are a tad muddled here and there. And the cast may not be completely, quote, realistic, but they, and the setting, and the soundtrack, and just the magic of the series really make it a great obscure anime memory. It makes it a series which stands out so easily upon itself. In fact, some go on to consider it one of the, quote, most animes of all time, because of all the weird things that it incorporates, and how it somehow makes it all work. With all of this established and the video getting long, I think it's time to call it for now, as I also have to cook up the scripts for the next installation in this series. So please, if you enjoyed this video, or just love the Vision of Escaflowne, please join me next time as I explore this amazing, obscure anime memory.